Hello, everybody. So let us begin. And today we are talking about a new book, um, which I have in my hands in a physical form. This is the book by Polina Barskova, Air Raid, in translations by Valzhyna Mort, and the book has been published by the Ugly Duckling Presse, and it is, as usually, Ugly Duckling Press does or used to do. It is a bilingual book, so here you can see both Russian text and English translation, and we will show you some pages during our conversation. So the most important feature of this book, of course, it is that it is the result of collaboration of two original poets. Of course, Polina, who is the author of poems, but also Valzhyna, who is appearing in the role of the translator while being an original poet writing in English and Belarusian as well. And of course, I need to introduce them properly, although I doubt that those who are present now on Zoom do not know who Polina and Valzhyna are, but I'm hoping for thousands and thousands of people attending the recording of our stream. So I will do the introduction nevertheless. Polina Barskova is a poet, a prose writer, and a scholar, author of 12 collections of poems and 2 books of prose in Russian, and some of them are English translations. Her collection of artistic, I don't know, creative nonfiction, living pictures, Tableau Vivant, received the Andrei Bely Prize in 2015 and is forthcoming in German with Surkamp Verlag and in English with NYRB. She edited the Leningrad Siege poetry anthology written in the dark, Ugly Duckling Press as well, and has 3 collections of poetry published in English translations: The Lamentable City, The Zoo in Winter, and Relocations. She has taught at Hampshire College, Amherst College, Smith College, and in 2021 she is already teaching Russian literature at the University of California at Berkeley. Valzhyna Mort was born in Minsk, Belarus. She is the author of Factory of Tears collected body, both from Cooper Canyon Press, and Music for the Dead and Resurrected. She is the recipient of the NEA Translation Grant Fellowship from the Lannan Foundation and Emmy Champit Fund from the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation, the 2000 Bess Hawking Prize for the Poetry Foundation, and the 2018 Gulf Coast Prize in Translation. She is translator of Air Raid, and she teaches at Cornell University and writes, as I already said, both in English and Belarusian. So back to the book about which I started talking. In certain ways, it is what in Russian used to is called избранное for Polina, although it is so selected work, selected text, but selected under a peculiar angle. This book includes historical poems, poems about history, poems with certain historical material, at least as their seed, right? And historical situations to which Polina reaches out here are not limited, as one would expect, by the Leningrad siege, which is, of course, Polina's main focus of her research and writing in prose and poetry, but to the Holocaust, to the Great Terror, to the war in general, and even to Ivan Turgenev and Polina Viardot. So this distant past is involved as well, which explains why this book, not typically for the books of poetry, is accompanied with the notes to the poems which clarify some historical allusions. And along with this, the volume, which I strongly recommend, of course, includes the conversation between Polina and Valzhyna, and this is one of the most, I would say, profound pieces of criticism that I have read recently, and what makes this criticism so so much important is that the criticism is addressed on the book that you're holding in your hands, and the analysis of texts are very pointed and sort of anchored in the book. So it is an amazing work of book production and of these two writers who created it as some kind of the living organism with its parts being interconnected. And it's hard to believe that these poems that you can read in this book have been created, I think, within 20 years at least, right?
Yeah, though most of them are rather recent.
Most of them are rather recent, but I think that the at least one of them is from 2011.
Yeah, there is some Juvenalia, yeah.
Not necessarily. Your Juvenalia is when you were 9 years old, I would say. Okay, so let us talk about the book, and let me speak less, and Polina will speak more. So I have the first question. My first question is exactly about the subject in general terms of this book and of Polina's poetry selected in this book, right? So why is it necessary for Polina to write about history and for Valzhyna to translate these poems into English today? So what is so important for you? And the question is addressed not only to Polina but also to Valzhyna in this history. And admittedly, aside of Turgenev and Polina Viardot, the most of historical plots involved into this book are traumatic, right? They're associated with tremendous violence of the 20th century, right? So certainly this question is having some answers, but frankly, I don't buy many of them. One answer is that this is the trauma, and this is sort of writing through the trauma, right? But this is not the trauma of your generation. Right? This is the trauma of not even of the generation of your parents, the generation before, right? And not that this trauma hasn't been written about, or these traumas. There is huge literature, both about Holocaust and the Great Terror, and the Siege of Leningrad hasn't been lost in literature. And that's why another argument about the mourning, the necessity to mourn the loss, the horror, the tragedy, is not working really well, at least for poetry, because poetry is about immediacy. And the act of mourning for these traumas is definitely not immediate, right? It certainly, we are separated from these events by decades. Right? So there can be another explanation that this history is in resonance with what's going on today in the world that we are living in. And indeed, there are resonances with, we know what's happening in Belarus, right? We know what's happening in Moscow with Memorial, and not only with Memorial, right? The parallels are obvious, but they're not emphasized in this poetry. This poetry sort of really only the subject of speech connects these historical plots with today's. So why are you writing about this history?
Thank you, Mark. Actually, I think this question that you are formulating obviously is, at the very heart, at the very matter of things. And very recently, I experienced something that again sent me thinking about whys of this obsession. We had a discussion with the Garage Museum in Moscow, a museum of contemporary art, and they arranged for a conversation. Of course, they disembodied one, with the poets and critics and Stepanova and Kukulin. Maria Stepanova and Ilya Kukulin were some of the participators. And again, questions were about why are we writing about the past? Why are we writing about memory and post-memory? And the conversation was witty and interesting. And somehow also I felt some resentment about it, answering again and again about why are we so committed to archaeological matters, and whether this commitment shows limitations of spectrum and inability to move on. Are we talking about the case, according to Sigmund Freud, of melancholy? Basically, the next day, thank you for reminding us, we got the news about the fact that the memorial is endangered. And these two phenomena, conversations, kind of blurred for me into an answer. That in our particular realm of the humanitas, right, using Latin term that is happening on the post-Soviet space, in the post-Soviet space, the past is not past. It just, maybe it would be healthy and honest to reconsider the model, the historical model. And of course, we daily are aware of what is happening to Khatabych, to Yuri Dmitriev, who is serving the undeclared time for being a historian, for his research. Studying history is very much the matter of today's discourse. And for me, this is the answer. Another answer maybe more immediately to what not just brought me to this inquiry, but kind of magnetized me into it. I'm often asked how it all began. It all began from one tiny exhibition called Блокадный дневник, the Siege Diary, put together from the works of the Museum of the Urban History in Petersburg, where I had an hour to kill, so I stepped in years ago. And I remember this very sharp feeling that I'm in the presence of works of, well, greatness, just kind of the sheer quality of what looked at me. And then it took years to figure out who these authors were. But most importantly, works of greatness of which I knew nothing, right? I am so full of my Petersburgian identity, and nevertheless, kind of lacuna was looking at me saying, we are here and we are invisible. And you know, this very moment in the Odyssey, where he goes down on the, like, спускается на лифте, and he meets all kinds of amusing shadows who tell him, we are here and we are invisible, but you depend on us. Your journey, possibility of your journey, depends on whether you'll be able to contact us. So that was kind of the feeling. I felt irritated by myself that I don't know anything about this. You know, this irritation of ignorance. Maybe that was a very powerful and very urgent and immediate trigger that started it all And then basically now for more than a decade, and feeds this conversation and meeting with the most amazing authors and citizens and observers and participants of history who were made invisible by this history. So this very feeling that we're not divided from this past. I think it was something that was helping, and more than that, guiding and dictating me to pay this kind of attention.
But let me make the question more provocative. And Valzhyna, I'm sorry, I'll give you the floor in a second, but I just want to clarify. I think that what you said is so much acceptable by everyone. Putin would agree with you, as he is from the family of the siege survivors. So what's the difference between what you are doing and the official cult of the past, and especially past associated with World War II in today's Russia, where it turned into some kind of political weapon against any form of dissent?
It's a good and provocative question indeed, because differences, I would suggest, are rather subtle. They are not that obvious. For example, every time when we mention notions like неизвестная блокада or неизвестная война, right? There is a possibility, there is place for a smirk. Like, are you kidding us? There are thousands of titles, of Soviet titles of books about the matter. And the question is not that, the question is not what, the question is how. And I would say what I am doing is different, and what my colleagues and interlocutors are doing variously would be in attention to particular lives and fates. Attention also, and we talked about this, to both kind of, this is an effort to make these personal stories, these micro histories, to unsublime them, to pay attention to both ugliness and all kinds of disgusting qualities of the political disasters, for example, the siege, but also paying attention to goodness that is there in these human stories, in these efforts to remain human. And I think, in my understanding, what the state was working on, and sometimes brilliantly, and the official writing of Bergholz, for example, would be the case of brilliance, is to disembody these stories and привести их к единому знаменателю.
Bring to the common denominator.
Right. So being particular and not to allow yourself, not to allow to look aside, to kind of to get distracted from sometimes difficult things that are always there, and difficult variously and unexpected.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Polina. Valzhyna, do you agree with this? Do you look at this differently?
I agree with this, and I also, I think, come with my own intentions and my own secret desires here to this text. I also come from a kind of a yearning, a sense of certain invisibility of certain narratives, certain lives. and also understanding that they are unsayable. These tragedies are unsayable, and I look as a poet for language for these things, and suddenly I find Polina's work. So I find language. More so, I find this is my first language, Russian, which is also kind of impossible language for me for literature. I do not write in Russian, and then I also have English, which are like kind of gloves that a criminal wears. That's how I like to think about it. And so I put on these gloves and I work on this mother tongue in order to solve my own problems with history and self. I really appreciate the directness of that question about trauma and history and the past. And I would like to say that for me, it's neither trauma nor history. It is just a sense of awe. I think Polina brought up this idea about the possibility of us and this sense of contact that is being searched. And so for me, this translation started with poem Air Raid, which is a series of poems, letters of a family that is separated. It seems like by labor camps, by war. In the letters, they search for each other. They cannot find each other. They don't know. They are in contact, but they do not know whether anybody is hearing them on the other end. And I personally have the story with lost letters. So here we have letters, but no family. And I'm somebody who is a person with lost letters. And so we are встретились два одиночества. Yeah, we kind of two pieces that complete each other. So I was brought up by my grandmother, who is the survivor, we could say, of the 20th century, in a very simple peasant Belarusian family. And my grandmother had a brother, older brother, Václav, who right at the beginning of the World War II was in a summer camp. And so when the war began, he was evacuated and separated from the family. Then by then was already disintegrating because of the Soviet-Polish War and all kinds of other things that happened in the 30s. And so he's a teenager who finds himself alone in Mordovia. He's hungry there. He doesn't know what is happening with this family that lives in a village in Belarus. After the war, he survives. After the war, he goes to Moscow and he does something that nobody before him did in our family. He enrolls into college. I don't know how he gets this idea after all of this war and hunger and separation. He makes this effort of getting into college and he writes letters to my grandmother, his sister. And these letters are very important for me because it's a kind of a sign of life. Yeah, it's that kind of fire that one makes on an island in order to send a signal. And he wants to be in contact. He's searching contact. He wants to say, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm visible, I want to be heard. And she's the only one left to hear him. And then he gets pneumonia and he burns, as they say. He dies very quickly, alone there. And so my grandmother tells me this story and I say, where are the letters? And she lost the letters. And of course, I cannot believe it because I understand that things burn and get killed and lost during the war, during, I don't know, all kinds of relocations. But after the war, how did she lose these letters? I could not understand. I was really indignant. And I felt that the strength of that signal that I'm here, hear me, is so strong that it reaches not only her, but it reaches all the way to me. And then I think of course, the whole this whole idea of a possibility of me. So it's all very selfish, really. It's all about self-knowledge, not about the past. And I think it's a very common story for people from Belarus, Russia too, where after the 20th century, World War I, we're occupied, and the 30s, World War II, we're occupied. Every third person dies in Belarus during World War II. So you are alive because, somebody jumped into the last wagon of the train, or maybe escaped jumping on the last wagon of a train. Somebody opened the door, or maybe somebody decided not to open the door, right? Maybe somebody slept in, or somebody like my grandmother left the bombed, what will be in a day, the bomb down Minsk on fire. It's all complete chance. And so this is the awe that I feel when sometimes I sit down and face myself, staring, for example, at my New Year's tree. And I'm in awe of just the possibility of me and how I came about because of these really incidents, of these non-decisions, a whole chain of them for 100 years, a chain of incidents, and I'm just kind of mesmerized by it, and that's why I'm so. I start translating these letters because these letters are there and nobody is there to claim them but Polina. And then I came and say, let me hold them also, let me pose with these letters for my family picture in my mind because I'm missing some letters. Yeah. And then very quickly, there is also with the siege, for me, it's also a way of substitution. In Belarus during World War II, which is also a big narrative, of course. And it's very important, I feel, that I also speak the way I feel about it, and not only the Belarusian regime gets to say that this is their narrative of victory, but it's a very painful narrative of a loss and of, we do not know how to live and how to be with ourselves. Should we be grateful? Should we be burdened? Should we be mourning? I do not know. So I'm not mourning. I'm not traumatized. I'm just in awe. And what happened in Belarus is that thousands of villages were burned down with all of the inhabitants gathered together in one building. So thousands of people died, people who lived on the same spot of earth for 500 years. And so all of them, from the oldest to the baby, would die together in one day. What to do with this? I do not know, but it's very interesting, or it's not interesting, it's just kind of heartbreaking then when we have these conversations, or the world has conversations about World War II. We're never talking about Belarus. We're talking about the Soviet Union, maybe, but we're never talking about these people who lived for centuries and then just disappeared in one day. So this is completely invisible, and I don't know what to do with it because this common denominator, as Polina was saying, it turned into a kind of a common denominator marble and common denominator wreaths that are bestowed by a group of men in gray suits one day in a year. And I'm not okay with this marble. I would like for it to be a part of a conversation rather than that.
So I think that both of you, thank you very much, Ballerina. I'm sorry. Thank you. I think that you both said about something. You have a common denominator, okay? So that you are trying to not allow hijacking the history by the state, as it was hijacked by the state in before 91, as it is now hijacked by the different states, but in the same way, in the way of sort of depersonalizing, heroization, and used it for the glory of that state and its representatives. You're trying to do something that would make this history, this pain, personalized, belonging to you, to your family, to people you know. But that's a very powerful move and drive, right? However, it is an interesting distinction because Polina said that she is trying to remove the history from the area of the sublime, while Valzhyna was repeating the word awe, and those of us who read Burke remember that awe is exactly the signifier of the sublime. So you one of you is trying to avoid sublime, the other is feeling this sublime nevertheless. I don't think that this debate, if there is a debate here, can be resolved theoretically. So I suggest that we read a few poems and let us begin.
Mark,
yeah,
I suggest that we read a few poems, and if possible, could we go directly to the letters?
Yeah, that's you took it from the tip of my tongue. Right, we will go to the area. So Polina, please, would you please read it first, and maybe we'll be breaking after each part, or you want to do the break after the entire piece?
The parts are brief. Also, I would like to introduce this it's questionable genre. It's both poema and a cycle. It's called the Air Raid that gave the name to the collection. In Russian, the name of this work is Воздушная тревога, which I think rarely I felt that something clicked in my mind so astutely than when I came up with this title, because for me, right, Воздушная тревога is of course the military term. This is what is being declared when the city is bombed. But also this very feeling that, going back to the beginning of our conversation, that this is something that, though coming from the past, pervades our todayness, our now, and maybe even projects onto the future, as тревога, тревожность do. Alarm and anxiety in Russian, importantly. So this is the story. John Bolt asked me to write an introduction to this publication of letters of the Miller family, where the libretto goes as following. The girl is evacuated, the girl Tata is evacuated from the besieged Leningrad. She is one of the few who make it out of the city during the first fall. Her beloved grandma remains behind in the city, and her beloved father is arrested and is sent to the camp. And there is this attempt of these three persona dramatis to connect via letters. And the very act of reading was for me so striking that I reacted to it, as poets do, and the reaction is described in the epigraph. These poems describe the trace left on me by the reading of letters. Письмо первое. Таточка, пишет тебе твой папочка. Ты на сердце моем латочка, ласточка. Какой день сегодня? День сегодня. Здесь каждый день сегодня. Вчера нет, завтра. Помещаюсь я сейчас с одним военным. Помещаемся на одном отделении нар. Он внизу, я наверху, человек он неплохой. Каждую ночь он кричит на непонятном языке. Сначала я удивлялся, пытался хоть угадать языковую группу. Теперь я грущу, томлюсь. Ночью мне кажется, что это секретное сообщение. Если бы я смог его разгадать, я бы узнал, когда увидимся мы с тобой. Деточка, что сказать тебе еще? Лечу свои зубы. Скоро мне будут делать железное, из нержавеющей стали. Так что скоро буду с остальными зубами. Смогу грызть железо. А как у тебя обстоят дела с зубами? Береги их, детка. Не запускай. Октябрь 41-го.
Valzhyna will read your translation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me open the picture there. Right.
Tatechka, this is your papachka writing. You are on my heart, a patch, a pooch. What day is it today? Day's today. Here, every day is today. No, yesterday, tomorrow. I'm housed with one officer. We are housed on one bunk. He below, me above. He's not bad. Every night he screams in an unknown tongue. At first I was intrigued, tried to guess the language family. Now I languish, sad. At night I wonder whether it's a secret message to me. If only I could decipher it, I would know when I'll get to see you again. Childkins, what else? I'm treating my teeth. Soon I'll get iron teeth, stainless steel teeth. So yes, soon I'll have steel teeth and will chew on iron. How are your teeth? Take good care of them, sweet dove. October 1941.
Письмо 5. Просьба о посылке. Заранее спасибо тебе, родная моя, за посылку. Вот только бы она пришла. Если можешь, бумаги и конвертов. Не отрывай от себя, не в ущерб себе. Если можешь, самых дешевых продуктов. Не отказался бы я от собачьего жира. Так что, если будут такие возможности у тебя, организуйте этот жир, посолив, чтобы не портилось, а при возможности немного подкоптив. Пойдет очень хорошо. Только условно будем называть этот жир козьим. Может быть, когда-нибудь встретимся. И я смогу быть благодарным тебе и за хорошие отношения, и за поимку собак. Но если не выйдет, был бы рад и отрубям, и подсолнечной жмыхи от масла, либо соевой, либо хлопковой.
Letter 5. Request for a care package. Thank you so much in advance for the package. Oh, please let it arrive. If you can, send paper and envelopes. But I beg you, only as long as it's not a sacrifice, not at the expense of your own well-being. Send, if you can, food, whatever is cheapest. I won't turn down dog fat. So if an opportunity arises, please organize the sending of this fat. Salt it so it doesn't go bad. If there's an opportunity to smoke it a little, That would be nice, but let's agree to call it goat fat. Perhaps one day we'll see each other again, a chance to thank you for your kindness and for the catching of the dogs. If this doesn't work out, I'd be happy with bran and oil meal or soy or cottonseed.
Письмо 6. Милая девочка, как меня радует, что ты пишешь. О себе писать нечего. Ленинградская жизнь вообще не подлежит описанию. Я страдаю модной болезнью, поносом и хожу теперь с палкой. Но как же меня радует, что ты пишешь. Папа твой, он не пишет. Мы не слышали от него ничего давно. Моих писем он, очевидно, не получает совершенно. Посылала ему за это время денег 2 раза, ответа положительно никакого. Так что мы даже предполагали, что его там вообще не существует. Решили, знаешь, положиться на время. Я сижу в бомбоубежище, моя милая девочка, в темноте. В темноте я вспоминаю твое лицо. Это радость от твоих писем. Бесконечно довольна я, что тебя нет с нами. И все время вспоминаю тебя. Радость. Какая радость! 3 твоих письма, одно за другим. Как хорошо, что тебя нет рядом со мной.
Letter 6. Darling girlkins, how happy I am that you're writing about me. I have nothing to write. Life in Leningrad defies description. I'm suffering from a trendy illness, diarrhea, and walk with a stick. But what happiness that you are writing. Your papa isn't. We haven't heard from him in a long time. It appears he has not been receiving my letters. I've sent money twice, got positively no response. So it's safe to conclude that he isn't there. We are relying on time now. I'm sitting in a bomb shelter, my darling dove. In the dark, I remember your face. What happiness, your letters. I am forever happy you're not with us. I remember you always. Happiness, happiness, what happiness? 3 letters from you, one after another. What happiness that right now you're not with me.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic poem, fantastic reading. Polina, may I ask, how close are your poems to the actual documents?
This is for you, for the scholars, to find out.
We won't tell anyone.
Each
Is it a free improvisation or is it a translation, so to speak?
Each letter focuses on a particular, each poem letter focuses on a particular moment from the real letter. So there is a moment of the real fragment of the real writing. And then I go with it and I work with it and I break it down and I do my thing with it. But I can attest and promise that the real prose is there. In my recent novella, «Отделение связи», the title again being untranslatable in a way, the separation of connection. The main character, tentatively based on Evgeny Schwartz, the prose writer, is called переписчик, the rewriter. My idea, right? The idea being that this is one of the functions that I think is crucial for us and for my particular process. And I think this is what I do. I rewrite these letters in order to understand the language, as Valzhyna said before, to understand the language better, to make it my own in a way, and also to make it more of today. День сегодня. День всегда сегодня. Yeah, this is my answer.
Okay. Would you mind? I think that this sort of leap of faith from the document to the voice is very different from what Tynyanov used to say. I begin where the document ends. Some kind of ventriloquism, right? And speaking from the position of the other, speaking from the position of the dead, literally, right? And I think that the poem that opens your book, the poem "A Sunny Morning in the Square," is quite amazing in this respect. Would you mind reading it as well?
Gladly. I just want to say that the conversation, to what extent what I do is unlike or like, or in continuation of Tynyanov, is hugely important for me, because I see his method actually as a huge inspiration. Maybe he's one of the main figures. And his own fate and his own tragedy of failure of language, I think he's a very powerful shadow. Солнечное утро на площади. Еще вчера мое сырое тело взрывалось, волновалось и хотело. Теперь оно, как листик, как листок, на поезде спешит на Белосток. Там 41-й. Или 39-й. Там страхом все обложены, как ватой. В коробке новогодние шары. Там живы все еще. Еще жары. Все обсуждают ранние явления и на столбу читают объявления. Явиться всем на площадь в 6 часов. С собой иметь 12 штук часов. С собой иметь 12 гончих псов. С собой иметь заслонку и засов. Все в городе молчат и говорят, на площади встречает их солдат. Во лбу сияет свастика, горит, во рту звезда. И он не говорит. Куда девать нам псов, засов, часы? Колени наши влажны от росы. Горящих листьев полны наши рты. Зачем мы здесь, солдат, с тобой на «ты»? Солдат внушает им. Здесь будет цирк. Вам чудеса предложит наш царек. Солдат вальяжно им. Да, будет крик. История навяжет вам урок. Прощенье, превращение. В 7 часов раздастся лай и грохот гончих псов. Уже к 8 свобода и отбой. Когда умрешь, скажи, и я с тобой.
Valzhyna, would you please read the translation?
A sunny morning in the square. My half-baked flesh, stuffed with its own tricks, finds itself as a leaf or a leaflet caught in the rush of a train to Belostok. Belostok stuck in 1941, 1939. Belostok padded in fright like a Christmas star stored away in its box. People still wake there, alive, living, ablaze. They discuss an earlier event and read an announcement. You are to appear in person on the square at 6. Bring only your wristwatches in the amount of 12. Bring only your greyhounds in the amount of 12. Bring only one bolt and one hatch. Belostok grows silent and speaks, stocked with soldiers in the amount of 1. Between his brows a swastika shines, in his mouth a star shuns speech. Where should we shovel our hunds, our watches, our hatch? Our knees bleed dew, our teeth rake burning leaves. Why, shiny soldier, are we so sweet with you? The soldier curses at them. We'll build a circus. Our circus king will show you his tricks. A star built of smoke and scream. History crams a lesson down your throat. Mercy me, master me on the square at 7. Greyhounds bark, hatches shine, wristwatches bang. By 8, the square is ready for bedtime. And you crack like a glass Christmas star. Arr, arr.
Could I?
Yes, please. Sure. You want to say?
Yeah.
Go
Every time when I hear this translation, and I become so upset with its ending, it physically undoes me, the sound. And there is something very important for me about the translation of your text being able to surprise you and to convince you somehow in an unexpected way. I just wanted to say, kind of preparing our conversation about translation of this work.
I wanted exactly to ask Valzhyna why she departed from the text so radically in the ending of this poem.
Well, since the poet is quite pleased, I feel like I did not depart, but in fact turn the train of translation onto the right rails. I think that as a poet myself who writes in 2 languages, I see a poem as a space, as a text with a lot of possibilities. And I think that what this particular ending enacts is what a lot of Polina's poems do, which is why I kind of had the guts of offer this ending to her, because I feel that a lot of her poems are a bit end at breaking. They go and go and go, and where a different poet would stop and say, you know, dear passengers, disembark here. This is our final stop. The train of her thought and of her pursuit of that sound and intonation and register, it does not stop at the final stop. And we're kind of in panic, and the train is rushing, and she's not going to stop until a crash, until the train breaks, or some kind of I didn't think of it as a train, but more of a clockwork toy that we turn and turn and turn, not to make it work, not to make it speak or walk for us, but to break it until it falls apart. And so here language falls apart, and it's horrible kind of when language falls apart, English falls apart into German. here. And of course, you can understand, and not only in this moment, that John Feldsteiner's translations of Paul Celan are very important to me. And the way that German emerges in the translation of the Death Fugue, which is probably the best translation, at least for me, the most important translation, poetic translation of the 20th century, the way that German comes in and annihilates English, takes over it. It's made a very big impression on me. And this is just an echo of that.
Thank you. May I ask in general, how did you work together? What was your process? And I'm sorry, Polina, to interrupt you. If you want to say something, please go ahead.
Yeah, the process and the answer to your question is incessantly and without any hope for the train to stop. There were moments when I would receive Valzhyna's suggestions at the time of the day, which I never suspected exist. It's, you know, this moment in Onegin when he finds out that there is early morning. So I need to say that this was maybe one of the most rigorous affair of translation that I went through. Also, I want to mention that at the final stages, it was crucial that we had Matvey Inkelevich as a mediator. Forever and forever, I need to stress that we, the whimsical authors and translators, would be nowhere without the editors, tyrannical editors. And the last thing I need to say, that maybe why it was for me such a difficult and spectacular process where I learned so much. This is a matter of conversation for our field. I think now it's a very interesting, especially interesting conversation because we're at an interesting moment for Russian poetry. But I don't see lives of my poems without sound. I think sound is crucial for this poetry's texture. Because we all understand that the situation with American poetry is completely different, there is an energetic and anxiety-producing, anxiety-ridden quest for compromise. So a big part of this was a question, how do we sound this poetry in transition, in translation? And I think the very fact, like this last line of this poem, that this train to maybe Bialystok or God knows where makes this screeching sound. For me, this is a very important sign that this text exists in English. Valzhyna?
Yeah, I also am driven by sound in translation, and it's always and as I read and write poetry, and I'm always amazed, or to use my sublime word, or in awe of how a sound is at once accidental, and yet there's nothing accidental about it. How then these accidental sounds, they create a completely different and valid and important set of new connections that was made by these accidental sounds. I think that it's very important to say words of gratitude for Matvey, because it's truly that I was very obsessed with these poems. I was so caught up in them, and I internalized them, and in such a way that I misremembered many of them. And so I would obsess following the sound and thinking about the work, asking Polina questions. And Polina was a great Belarusian partisan. You know, trust all your secrets to Polina. She does not, no matter at what early hour you wake her up with a question, she does not give in. And she does not tell the answer. It's a secret. And so I was obsessing. And when Matvey put the Russian and my English next to each other and was looking at the two with me, I found myself very often saying, I must have translated an earlier version of this poem. And I would say things like, I think she rewrote this later. That's why there are these discrepancies. And I would say in the book that I have, you know, it's just like it is in my translation, not the way it is here. You probably have a different source for these poems. And I have Polina's books, separate books. I have her selected. So I have all of these Russian books, and I would go frantically through them looking for those versions that I remember I read. And then I would go online and search for these versions that I imagined existed until I would give in and start revisiting the translation and rethinking things.
This is quite amazing because what you're saying, I think, is what Polina is doing in her poems herself, not only with documents, as we already discussed, but also, for instance, this wonderful poem, A Sunny Morning in the Square. I read it as something that sort of, if I don't know, Harms doesn't die when he dies, right? And by some fantastic miracle would write about Białystok and about Holocaust or Vidensky or even Aleynikov. So ventriloquism that I mentioned, I think in Polina's works, goes deeper, and she sort of writes for those poets who are also victimized by the time, sort of letting them speak through her, and you are continuing this. So basically, Polina appears as the translator herself, as the translator of unwritten poems, and so it's only logical to continue translating this poetry into another language, creating what we may call the variation on the theme, right, rather than word to word rendering in English. So, and you probably guessed that I mentioned Abiryuts not only because they appear here, they also appear in another poem, which frankly is my favorite in this book. And I'm very much self-serving, and I'd like you to read a children's book if it is possible.
Yeah, and it looks like it will be our last poem, given what's happening.
Maybe you will read for Anchor, God knows. Maybe there will be so much bravo coming from the audience that you read another. We'll see.
Okay. Книжки с картинками. Они пытали их обоих. Какого цвета на обоях они оставили следы? Конечно, только золотые. Конечно, только голубые. Горение, слюны, слюды. Смотришь на дивные оттенки. Они остались на застенке. Сюда идем мы как в музей. Что видим мы в музее этом? Вот видим. Стрекозиным летом блуждает череда друзей. Хармс сторонится. Шварц хохочет. Олейников его не хочет. Знать он лежать у речки хочет. И жабу палочкой крушить. Их путь еще не кончен, начат. И все они уже дозначат поэзию и крутят нить. Сквозь стрекозу, сквозь паутину смотрю на жаркую картину. Я вижу их живыми не. Один во льду, другой на дыбе. Введенский плавает на рыбе. Мерцает Вагинов на дне.
Children's literature. Both were tortured. What color traces did they leave on the wallpaper? I bet you golden. I bet you blue. Burns of crystal, drool. Observe droll colors preserved in the confines. We come here to a museum. What do we see in this museum? We see a trail of fellows who dragonfly on summer days. Harms shies away, Schwarz ha-has, to Schwarz Aleynikov prefers to slug by a stream, poking a toad to death. The journey has just begun, not ended. They stand for poetry and weave their thread. Through web, through a dragonfly's wing, I watch a blistering scene and see them living not. One in the ice, another on the rack. Poet Vedinsky floats atop a pike. Poet Vaginov twinkles on the river's bed.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was wonderful, truly wonderful. So I think we should open the floor for questions, and I wonder if we have the chat and we have the Q&A function, so let's hope that the questions will be coming. So while the questions are coming, right? May I ask another question to Valzhyna? Valzhyna, did you since Polina's voice, as I said, is frequently mediated by not just influences but the voices of other poets. Did you try, or how did you obviously managed to do this, but definitely you couldn't rely, for instance, on Aberud's poetry, which doesn't have the idiom in English. So what idiom did you use in this poem? Was it just following the sound, or was it some with an eye on some Anglophonic poetry in the neighborhood?
Thank you. And by the way, thank you for your blurb, Mark. I always knew that Polina's poems, Polina's voice in Russian sounds a little off to me. Yeah. And so in my translation, I never shied away from sounding like an immigrant. I did not look for a particular poet in English who has a similar idiom. Instead, I tried actually to speak back to the Eastern European discourse, to the Eastern European space, but in that mask of English. So it's a kind of a speech that is off, but also is very musical. And I was translating this book as I was writing my own book, it was, whatever I couldn't say, Polina said, and it was a way for me not to face my silence, but to keep writing.
Wonderful, thank you. And here is the follow-up question for you. Valzhyna, you have described your sense of musicality as limited, but you are very attuned to sound and phrasing. Do you write and translate silently or aloud? Asks Deborah Kelly.
Oh, I'm obviously an aloud person, and I do not have an ear for music. It has been confirmed by about 15 years of music lessons, and also singing in the opera house in Minsk, where I was in the children's studio, but not allowed to make sound on the stage. I was asked to open my mouth, and I was kept on the stage for many years. For about 7 years, I was on the opera house, in the stage of the opera house in Minsk, because all the children grew and I didn't grow. I was short, and so I was experienced, and I could be hidden among children, where I could watch them on the stage, make sure that they leave and don't go where they were not supposed to go. The only thing that I couldn't do was actually sing. I had to pretend to be singing. And so I'm just somebody who, well, speaking of trauma, my trauma is only funny. I could only speak of trauma as something funny. Yeah, I'm somebody who has been just playing music and singing without any talent for it, but with a lot of love for it. And but I can hide better when I deal with language. But I also want to say something about, we talk about past and history and trauma, but there is not just Siege in this book. There's not just Holocaust in this book. There are also poems about snorkeling. Yeah, there are poems about book shopping. There are poems about being a mother. There are poems about going through a divorce. There are poems about having friends. There are poems about different places. There are poems about going to other people's readings and art exhibitions. There are poems about walking on the beach. And these poems are very important for me in this book, because that kind of a question that Polina, I think she actually poses it in our conversation: how do we live after the catastrophe? How does one live? And these poems, they answer that question. How do we live after all of these catastrophes? We have children, get divorced, walk on the beach, go to poetry readings, buy books, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. But this calls for a question to Polina. All these things can be done without catastrophe, right? And they are done without catastrophe. How does catastrophe in the past, catastrophe to which you are connecting through poetry, how does it affect things that are more or less normal, right? Walking on the beach, raising children, having your family life with its dramas. So does it make things worse, better? Does it put them into the perspective? So by placing these poems next to poems about the siege and and Holocaust, you definitely were trying to create certain conversation between them. How would you define? Of course, it's the job of the literary scholar to define this, but what was your intention? It's no in literary scholarship to think about the author's intention, unless you ask the author directly. So we ask the author.
I think starting from this book of prose that you mentioned and that will be coming in English soon, Living Pictures, that also connects under one cover stories directly in conversation with the Leningrad 1941 and completely different material, and asked by many publishers by now, how do you imagine what unites all this? My answer is one human story. This is the framework. These are all texts answering the question how one can live after having read these things. Like even yesterday, my friend who just read this book, Air Raid, told me, I'm concerned about you. There is so much darkness in this, to which I can say, please read closer. There is also laughter. There is also various degrees of light. It just, it's constantly in chiaroscuro. Once you include these conversations, and you're absolutely right, there is not only, I don't know, Bergoltz or Krandievskaya or Gore here, but also Sergei Dovlatov or Emily Dickinson. What I suggest and what suits me, right? All this is very, very subjective. And it's only, it's such happiness that I have Valzhyna as my interlocutor or Mark as my interlocutor. But it's a very subjective situation that this is life, indeed, as Adorno taught us, after, but also life with inclusion, using the fashionable, important term, life, rightly life, that includes all these stories and presences. And yes, I do walk the seashore, thinking about Zaltzman, thinking about Vaginov, because they're amazing interlocutors also. I would say that.
Mark, your microphone is off.
My microphone is typically off. I apologize for this. So we already have a conversation, but in the chat. But let me read the question addressed to Polina, and then Valzhyna, if you want mind. After Polina, could you please answer it too? So, question to Polina from Dmitry Manin. Obviously, rhyme for you is an expressive device that has its uses. Could you talk a bit about what kinds of poems call for rhyme in your practice and what don't?
This is a very complicated question for me. To some extent, this is about immediacy and physiological response, since I actively write both. And recently, for example, I've been writing without rhyme and being very kind of happy about it, embarrassed and happy. I can answer, there is a cycle in this book, Справочник ленинградских писателей, the directory of the Leningrad writers, which among other things works with the notions of sound in the besieged Leningrad. Actually, it's a text about the sensory of the disaster. For me, that text is primarily about how the disaster sounds. Part of it was written while I was working in Petersburg in the Society of the Blind Citizens, where a librarian was reading me the siege diaries in Braille and teaching me how to read it with my fingers. So I absolutely knew that, for example, that whole text needed to sound in all kinds of disturbing ways. And for me, it is absolutely crucial that Valzhyna entered that situation with me. So I guess this is an example, but that kind of offers a larger reading. It absolutely depends. It comes from case to case. Sometimes afterwards, I can explain why it was necessary for me to rhyme. Sometimes no. But overall, that this poetry works with sound provocatively and integrally. This is something that I insist on. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you, Polina, for the answer. Valzhyna, what do you do when you have rhyme in Polina's poems? It happens sometimes, right?
Rhyme. I love rhyme, and there is kind of a misconception that contemporary English language poetry does not rhyme. It's not true. There are quite a few contemporary English language poets, British and American poets, who rhyme and do it really well. But I think that the contemporary tradition of irregular rhyme is much stronger and corresponds to that provocative nature of sound that Polina has just talked about better. And so for me, it was important that it was always natural. But of course, natural means that still I have to listen very carefully and make sure that I do not miss those opportunities. And I think that I hope that whoever reads the translations would hear that they are full of irregular rhymes, sometimes full rhymes too. They're all driven by sound, and they always think about the rhythm in a provocative way, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you. May I ask you a strange question? The question to Polina and to Valzhyna, of course. Is there a poem in the text that in the book, in the entire book, that might serve as some kind of sorry to say this, meta description, right? So the poem that describes the process of poem writing. Is there anything?
Many.
Oh,
I would say
let's pick one.
The letter cycle is one of them. I want to, if this is the opportunity, I want
It is, I think.
one poem that we also discussed that is very important for me. Again, it's written in response to this kind of never-ending lamentation about me being a poet of lamentation, right? Alkanost. Actually, again and again, I ask my readers to stay with me and to be attentive and to look for this мерцание that, for example, we just noticed about Konstantin Vaginov. So maybe the last poem called Радость is about, for me, it's a meta text, obviously, to your question about the kind of joy that one experiences being a poet and historian of the 20th century kind of history that we got. But also, it's a statement that these things are of joy. It's a particular kind. But when I think about all these characters and this book, as you've noticed, the footnotes, there are many, many characters. It's a crowded book. But when I think of them, one of the strongest things that I feel is joy. Радость. Вот возвращается из-под шкафа давно оплаканная, бесценнейшая, копеечная серьга. Венецейское стеклышко. Виновато поблескивая сквозь пыль, как будто сквозь мех. Допустим, Полина Анненкова, упавшая в темь, в снега просроченной жизни. Кем ты будешь теперь? Здесь уже все привыкли, что нет тебя на земле, поплакали, да зачислили в сытный список потерь. Читинская льдинка, дурочка, будешь лежать в тепле моей ладони. Потом в уютной коробочке со своею парою, своею младшей сестрой, тоже несколько поцарапанной в ходе времени, тоскою просто и по тебе тоской. Теперь вас можно вынести в свет, чтобы каждая шептала мне на ушко, как здесь светло и радостно, и просто, и хорошо.
Joy. An earring returns from under the cupboard, a bewept, priceless, pennyworth Venetian bauble, twinkling with gilt through the dust or possibly fur. Say, Polina Annenkova, cast into the murk, the snows, is it moss or musings of a life past due? What will you do now? We've grown used to your absence on earth, wailed and listed you among losses, a hearty beast, a nice chip in the Decembrist exile, a goofball. You will lay in the heat of my palm, then in a cozy box next to your pair, your baby sis, also scratched in the transit of time by plain yearning or yearning for a pair. Now you can be carried into the light, in my ear, the whisper of you, how bright and nice and plain and good.
Thank you so much. We have the last probably question for Valzhyna. Dean Alice asks, I wonder as a translator myself, if Valzhyna agrees with Seamus Heaney's statement about translation. It can't be done, it must be done.
Oh, I love and agree with everything that Seamus Heaney has said. And I think that it's also true of poetry, right? It can be done. I think that that question that Mark has been asking us, but why? And so it must be done because we do not know why. And I remember when I read Polina's poems for the first time, my immediate reaction, completely unconscious, was a thought to myself, a note to myself to never try to translate this, even though nobody was asking me to do it.
Right. That's a relief that you didn't follow your first instinct, right? So I think that it's a good time and a good moment to wrap it up, and we don't have any new questions. And but I want to use this opportunity to thank you both very much for, first of all, for the wonderful book and for the wonderful book that now exists in 2 languages, and we can read it in the way we want to. And I hope that there will be more books coming from you, and that we'll have more chances to speak about poetry with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Harriman Center, and our wonderful, somewhat invisible audience. Hope to meet you in 3D sooner than later and read books together. Thank you. До свидания.
До свидания.
Thank you.